I am joined right now by strategist, storyteller, and author Tamsen Webster. She's a former TEDx producer and has worked with organizations like Johnson & Johnson, Harvard Medical School, and Intel, as well as with hundreds of individual founders, academics, and thought leaders to help experts drive action with their ideas. She's also the author of the new book, Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible, which is out this week. Tamsen, welcome to BossBetter Now.
I am so excited to be here, Joe Mull. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to have you here. What is the red thread, and how does it make ideas irresistible?
So, the red thread is the story that your brain builds to connect a question and an answer, a problem and solution, an issue and an idea. Our brains make sense of information all the time. We tell ourselves stories consciously and not to explain why the world or we behave the way that we do. And the reason why figuring out what the red thread of your idea can make it irresistible is that essentially you're building that story that people will tell themselves about your idea. And those are the most irresistible stories of all.
I think it's obvious just in that description that your model and this book in particular has a ton of utility for bosses. So let's talk about that. How can the book and the model function as a tool or a resource for leaders?
Well, I think I designed it very much for business people because I think when I first started figuring out this aspect of my work about 5 years ago, right in the earliest days of the red thread, what I was trying to do was reverse engineer all the kind of intuitive knowledge I had gained in the 20 previous years I'd spent as a brand and message strategist. In that case, it was my job to be presented with a situation and figure out not only what to say, but the right way to say it. And then about 5-7 years ago, I was in a position of starting to help other people figure out what to say and the best way to say it. And I couldn't just tell them what to say. Because in certain cases, these were speakers for TEDx Cambridge, so they needed to be the ones to present this. And, there were a fair number of leaders as well. And I mean, you being a speaker as well, that the best way to connect with the audience is to make sure that you're fully connected with what you're saying. So what I found was that even though lots of us know that storytelling is a really powerful way to get information across, not everyone feels comfortable telling stories. They don't see themselves as storytellers. And B, what I found, particularly 5-ish years ago, was that a lot of the information on how to tell a story was really not business leader friendly. A lot of it was based on the hero myth, which is a great story structure, by the way. But it's also 7 to 12 steps, depending on which one you would, And so I really wanted to find a simpler way for people to be able to structure information so it felt like a story and had the impact of a story, even if it wasn't told as a story. And the red thread is the result of that.
Oh, it's fantastic. And for so many reasons. I know that when I work with organizations and we do data collection at the employee level and we ask folks, what needs to change here, or what needs to get better, or what would you like to have happen more often, to fix ABC problem? Regardless of what ABC problem is, one of the most common complaints is communication. And when you ask folks what needs to change about that, the answers are wildly vague. And so what are the keys to sharing ideas and information in a way that will lead others to feel informed and involved?
Well, you actually stated the answer right in your question in the way that you set it up, because a lot of times the big failure in communication is we forget to think about the other side of it. We focus so much on what we want to say and the point that we get across and the reasons why we think that's the right thing to do, that we forget that the other people that we're talking to aren't convinced yet and may not have the same level of knowledge or predisposition to saying yes to whatever this is. So one of the big things that this book is really about, and one of the core ideas that it's based on, is that communication doesn't happen unless what you send out is actually received. And so part of what I've tried to build into the red thread is understanding what are those pieces of information that the brain needs to hear to connect between here's what we're doing and why. Sometimes just those two pieces aren't enough. We have to give people a little bit more information. And so that's really what the book is meant to do, is to help people, whether they realize it or not, kind of slowly turn the camera around so that they're looking at their communications from the perspective of the person who's going to hear it, and building that person's case for the idea, not just their own.
I'm thinking about what you say in the book about how most of our decision making is unconscious and that our brains are navigating a maze we can't see. And that sounds like something that might work against us when we're trying to communicate. So tell us a little bit more about that. How do we overcome those kinds of barriers?
Well, so it comes back to the fact that in all of that pre-conscious decision making, what is known is that the brain is processing that information in a very specific way, and we know what that is. It's story. We are processing information as story, and it isn't necessarily those once upon a time stories, but they're explanations, right? And stories are explanations, and most explanations are stories. And so what we can do to understand what really needs to be part of any kind of really effective change communication is to look at those once upon a time stories and borrow from them what the main pieces are. Because a story only makes sense when it has those pieces, like a once upon a time story only makes sense. So this kind of, if you map over and say, well, if a story makes sense when it has all these pieces, kind of any idea will make sense if it has all those pieces. And so that really is what the main elements of the red thread process are figuring out and mapping over those once upon a time story elements to communication elements. What pieces of information must be in your communication in order for it to really be understood and ultimately acted on.
And so it sounds like this is something that at a very minimal level, leaders at least need to build time in for. Right? If I'm thinking about how I want to transfer knowledge or share information or just get people to buy in to whatever it is I'm either selling or advocating for, that I can't just show up and wing it and speak off the cuff, right? And just sort of speak extemporaneously about it. I need to be intentional in carving out some time when that's our most valuable commodity, right? We don't all have time to do it. But what I hear you saying is, if we can be thoughtful and intentional about doing it and we can use the right ingredients, we supercharge that communication much more effectively.
Absolutely. And the more that you do it, and I know this from seeing my clients now, having worked with this for 5 years, the more that you do it, the closer you can get to winging it in the moment. But it's still never winging it without anything. I mean, in the beginning, it's like any skill. You're going to want to spend time. It takes practice saying, okay, well, what is the question that my audience is asking that this idea isn't an answer for? Not what question do I wish they were asking, but what are they asking right now? I mean, just that one step will radically change the impact of your message, because you're starting with what your audience wants to know and not what you want them to know. But once you've got that basic framework in your head and those elements, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about them quickly, is goal, problem, truth, change, action. It becomes one of those things that becomes a little bit second nature. This is what my clients tell me, is that over time, even if they haven't sat down and figured those things out, that someone asks them a question, well, there's that question they want to know the answer to, and their brains can kind of immediately go, okay, well, what's the problem in perspective? Okay, what's this truth that kind of makes that problem possible to ignore? Okay, what's my feeling on this? What approach do I feel is the right one? Okay, what might that look like? And just having that framework ends up becoming a very easy thing to kind of know that you always can fall back on. And honestly, like I said before, it's one of the reasons why I developed it the way that I did, is that I wanted and needed people who were busy and didn't have a lot of time to have something that could, in a short amount of time, really radically change the impact of their communications.
Well, and I don't know anybody who doesn't find value and comfort in structures and models that provide for us a kind of roadmap to if I plug the right pieces in the right order, what comes out at least has a pretty good chance of being effective. And so it sounds like we've got some of that here. So you rattled it off. Why don't we go back, give those ingredients to us again, and within that list, where do people tend to fall short the most?
Sure. Well, kind of everywhere. Well, the first, let me talk about in the order where things get missed. There are a couple places that definitely get missed, and I'll talk about that. But the very first piece is what I call the audience's goal. Easiest way to find that, I said it before, ask yourself, what question are these people currently asking for which they don't have an answer, but that your idea, your communication contains the answer. Mm-hmm. So what question are they currently asking? So it can be anything from like, why can't we do X more? Or how can we improve Y? Or what can I do to get X, Z out of my company? Again, it's not necessarily what you wish they were asking. It's what are they actually asking right now? It does need to be something that your idea answers, but start there. So that's the goal. That's the audience's goal. I'm going to say that again, audience's goal, right, not yours. So that's the first piece. And that matches story structure in the way that when a once upon a time story starts, we don't really get fully engaged into that story until we establish what the main character wants, but doesn't yet have. So most people generally are familiar with the Harry Potter movies. So I like to use that as an example. We may be curious about why a wizard is leaving a baby on a doorstep, but we don't really engage with the story until we meet Harry and realize that Harry wants a family that he does not have. He wants to belong somewhere and doesn't yet. So that's the goal. So once we see the audience, once we know what the audience wants, they are going to lean in. This is a story they're going to tell themselves, because if it's a question they're asking, they're like, oh, this is about me. I have that question. Mm-hmm. The next piece is just like in any major story, there's a problem that gets in the way, but a problem that the character didn't know about when it got started. So Harry has no idea that Voldemort is out there and is going to stand in the way and threaten the potential for him to have a place where he belongs. And the same thing is true in any kind of business messaging, that standing in the way of your audience's goal is something that they don't know about yet. Now, I call this a problem of perspective, because a lot of times, speaking to where we sometimes get this wrong, we jump right to, well, the problem is you're doing it wrong. Essentially, that's what we're saying. But if we understand that how we see the world drives what we do, then the first thing we actually need to figure out is, well, how are they looking at the situation that explains why they're doing that? And so we need to identify that lens. So the problem is always a two-part problem. Okay. It's their current perspective, and then a new perspective that kind of intuitively would make sense to them, but where they would agree they're not focusing right now. So for instance, one of my clients, Tracy Tim, I think you know Tracy, maybe you don't. She's out of Dallas. Her audience was CEOs who have a lot of millennial employees. And their question was, how can we keep millennial employees from leaving? Like, what are these? They don't respond to any of the incentives that we have. What are these new levers of loyalty? That's the question. The problem of perspective that we identified was that most of the time, the answer to that, like what incentives can we use, were anchored to the position. Well, if you're at this level, you get these perks. And if you're at this level, you get these perks. And they were focused more on the position, perspective one, than on the people in them, perspective two. And you notice what we're doing there is that we're not doing it, giving them anything radically different or radically new. We're just saying, would you agree that you pay more attention to the positions than the people? That's traditionally where the focus has been.
Sure.
Yes. Okay. So now we've got a goal, we've got a problem. In a once upon a time story, there's always something that's known as the moment of truth, right? Where and my favorite word for this is anagnorisis. It is that
that's
moment,
like $1.50 word.
Right? I know. But it's a Greek word talking about this moment in any story, every story, by the way, good story, where the main character recognizes the true nature of their circumstances. And so with Harry Potter, this is the moment where Harry realizes that in order for him to save his family, in order for him to battle, like it's going to come down to him. Like he's got to do this, and he's got to do it even if it means he doesn't survive. And your story that you're building for your audience's brain needs to have the same thing. It needs to have something, some additional piece of information that they believe is true, they would agree is true, that because they believe it's true, threatens what they want. So for instance, back to the Tracy Tim example, if they're focusing more on positions than people, and yet we can agree it's true that people are what make positions work. If you want to keep your millennial employees from leaving, all of a sudden you're like, uh-oh, I'm going to have to do something different. I'm going to have to make a choice. So in a story, that choice drives a change. So we've got goal, problem, truth, change, right? Harry has to do something different. Harry has to embody the fact that Harry, you're a wizard, and he's actually gonna do this thing. And then in our message story, right, it's saying, okay, so the solution then, and this is what Tracy helps leaders do, is to personalize the incentives to the people in the positions. And she's not saying get rid of the position levels, but she's saying, hey, if somebody's at this level, give them options. And if at this level, give them options.
Right.
And what you see is now you've got kind of a complete story that someone goes, okay, I see why this makes sense. The last piece are just what actually happens. What are the actions that people take? So, for Tracy, those actions would be what are the specific programs and specific things that she does with leaders in order to help her do that. But those are the 5 pieces: goal, problem, truth, change, action. And when you've gotten all there, what you do is basically just wrap it back up to the goal and say, hey, look, did you get what you wanted? Absolutely. And there's actually a little bonus in the book because there's this thing I call the goal revisited, where it's like the cherry on top of the sundae on top of the cake that you have just given them and allowed them to eat as well, which is what else do they get? So goal, problem, truth, change, action, and it kind of brings them back to the beginning.
Well, I hope everyone who is listening to this will favorite this episode so that you can continually come back to that super mini masterclass that Tamsen just gave us. And to go deeper, you can get the book. And I'm going to ask you in a minute to tell folks where they can get the book, Tamsen. What is so exciting to me as someone who has watched others embrace your methodology, use it, as someone who myself has used that very formula you just outlined, what I see happening over and over again is when the audience experiences that, they go, oh, I never thought about it that way. But then it feels like common sense. They say, well, of course, it makes total sense. And so it's almost paradoxical, right? I never thought about it that way, but it feels like common sense. And then I'm leaving inspired and excited to take action, not because I saw a motivational speaker, but because now I have answers. I have insight that I necessarily didn't have before, and I've got answers that I can go act on because this was packaged and delivered to me in such a way that it just all clicks.
Yes. I said it before. This is all about building the story that people will tell themselves. And the reason why that's so important is because we're going to do it anyway. And most of the time, our brains are wired to tell a story that talks us out of doing anything different than we're doing right now. And so what we have to do is we have to build a story that makes more sense than the status quo, that feels like it's more able to achieve what somebody wants. It feels like it's closer to things that they already believe. And I think that's probably one of the more counterintuitive things that people discover through this method, is that oftentimes that the best way to change people's behavior doesn't lie in changing what they want and believe. It actually lies in upholding what they want and believe, but getting them to look at those things in a slightly different way.
Boy, talk about a truth statement. That's a beautiful bow on the end of our conversation. Tell folks where they can get this fantastic book.
All things Red Thread Book can be found at redthreadbook.com. And so we've got some good goodies there for people who buy multiple copies. But you can find the links to all the online places where it lives right there at redthreadbook.com.
Well, I'm so glad you joined us today. And for our boss heroes listening, I have a feeling that they, like I, will be going back through this conversation more than once and just mining it for all of that insight. Thank you for being here today, Tamsen.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.